Hello and welcome, Campbell here, autodidactic, and I am here with my friend Paula, and today we're going to have a chat about the Melbourne International Expo building, which is still standing. Pretty nice building, obviously very old world and oversized and all that stuff. And of course, you know, the narrative built by horse and cart, chisels, no power tools, you know, hardly even a steam shovel. But they built, you know, these amazing buildings that we still cannot even try and replicate today. So how you going, Paula? Welcome.
Oh, hi, Campbell. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
That's good. We've got to fill in a lot of information in a short period of time, which is very hard.
We do.
There's so much out there. Okay, let's get started. So
Right.
I've done the Australian, as you have. I've followed up on a lot of the Australian World Fairs and exhibitions. Some very interesting background stories in those too. But today I want to concentrate on Melbourne, where I come from. And yeah, very interesting. So I went and did some research and found that our earliest exhibition building was in 1854. But previously, we had 2 attempts. And bear in mind, we really weren't a settlement until, well, really had anyone here until 1835. And even then, they were trying to get rid of everybody because they didn't want anyone in Melbourne for some reason. We weren't allowed to settle here. So in 1835, we had not much of a population. I think there was like 137 men and 27 women and very little children. So we then speeded up to, I don't know if we've had 2 attempts before 1854, maybe 1840 and maybe before 1840. We don't know. There's no record. There's just a mention. So that goes by, that also backs up the 1840 interest in England for the exhibition buildings. In France, in the 1700s, there was a lot of this going on. But they were just small little manufacturers' exhibitions. They weren't really big until the English one in 1849, which wasn't the Crystal Palace. It was in Birmingham, which is very interesting.
So not the London,
because
okay.
Yes, and it's even more interesting because it goes full circle for me for the orphan children and the convict children that I've done, because Birmingham has a statue of 3 men, 3 deities in gold that are looking at and surveying a plan for humanity's future. They are the 3 men of the Industrial Revolution. Da-da-da!
Wow. And that's still there, that statue?
That's still there, that statue. They're still looking at their plans for humanity. And guess what their plan was? To use the most rawest resource in the world. Children. That's another story.
Wow.
Anyhow, we then have the Crystal Palace, as you've done your story on, in England.
Yeah.
In 1855. So Melbourne decided in 1854 that we were going to have a Crystal Palace as well.
Wow.
So in 1854, when we had very little, and I've researched this, very little industrial in this area, and I've even got a directory of 1858 which even proves the lack of labourers and the lack of manufacturers, because we were still importing everything. I did a little bit. Now, going back to 1854 exhibition buildings, it was a 2-storey building, 20,000 feet of interior for their exhibition. We had 200 ornate glass windows and we had a glass roof.
And when was this? 1854?
1854.
Wow.
Now, that's interesting because I did a little bit of background research on the first production glaziers in Melbourne. So we will go back to them, and excuse me, I've got to go back because I've got all this documentation that comes from a lot of references from a lot of good sources like old books and old companies that write their history in these books or catalogues, and it comes from the National Archives, and a lot of it comes from museums and universities. Just thought I'd point that out. So Pickering, their first shipment of glass for Pickering, which was a very well-known glass manufacturer in Australia, arrived in Geelong in 1856, 2 years after 1854, and established their Melbourne office in 1879. Then there was no glass actually manufactured until some small pieces were manufactured in 1860 by a plumber who made ornate lead lighting for the time, but for only certain, like contracted. So not much.
Yeah, small
Not
piece.
much at all. Yeah.
And so they didn't actually start producing glass in Melbourne until, like in any numbers, until the 1870s. Was that right? 1876.
And that wasn't much because they were still actually importing from England up until 1880 in some things.
And that's the next question is, how do you, how feasible is it to import glass on one of these little wooden boats, right, going over the ocean, up and down waves? I mean, they weren't that big, these boats. They got thrown around.
How long did it take? 12 months, Campbell.
Yeah, 12 months, yeah.
12 months. And we're having exhibitions. The first one in 1854 was for 3 months. Yeah, and it was built in 77 days.
In 77 days. Nice.
Yep, precisely 77 days. And we had 434 exhibitions of materials. So I went and had a look about the history of sash windows because I thought, okay, there was a lot of sash windows at that time. So in Australia, all the glass was imported according to the sash windows history until 1930. Glass manufacturing was very, very expensive and limited to producing very small panes from cylinder glass. So when you do your research, you just don't go on one subject. As you know, Campbell, glass was a very painstaking operation where it was hand blown into massive cylinders that were then cut and cooled and pressed to make a window pane.
Wow. So you have to basically unmold.
Well, you did your research on the glass that was being made in England, which the narrative tells you a totally different amount because there is someone else that we know who does research, who interviewed his friend who does a lot of research on the World Fairs, and he found out on the original documentation that was held in the archives, the London archives, that the panes used was double, if not triple, the amount they actually quoted.
Yep. On my first video on the Crystal Palace, they couldn't make glass panels that big, and they tell you that. But yet there they are.
And it's stating what I found too. They could only make small panels, and if they needed bigger panels, it had to be made with the iron in between to give it support.
Yes, yeah. And hence lead light. That's why lead light, we see so much of it, right? Because you only need little bits of glass and then you just fix them all together into a big pane, yeah.
Because it was so very expensive to produce. You needed, to do that glass, apparently in London, you needed every person and apparently they only had 30 workers blowing that glass. There was 30 of them. It would take, for the time they said that place was built, those people, more than 30 was required, and they would have to be making a pane of glass every minute without a break 24/7.
Yep. Yeah. I think
With
the Crystal Palace, it was somewhere up near 20,000 panes a day or something. Like
yes.
20, non-stop for 7 months, because that again was only built in 190 days or something.
Exactly. So,
thick, so that, you know.
What are they, superhumans or something? Because it's just humanly not impossible if you do your mathematics and the background on how these things are made. So then we go forward. There is I've got an original copy of the catalogue for the 1854. Can you bring that up just to show people that? So that's the building.
Yep, exhibition building, big glass roof on top there.
Yep, that's the stamp, and that's the author. Can you say it for me, please, Campbell?
What are we saying? Authenticity, authorised?
Authenticity, that's the word, authenticity of where I'm getting my information. So I've got a few photos and sketches of this beautiful building. Again, a competition winner, Campbell.
Well, of course, it's a competition winner. My gosh, it's a World's Fair building, right?
Yes, of course it is. Wouldn't be anything different, would it? That's a picture of the building at its opening.
1854 in Melbourne. And that building, I'm pretty sure, I haven't seen that building in Melbourne, so it looks like whatever it was,
that building was built. It's gone now, but it was on the corner of, this is from the State Library. It was on the corner of Williams and Little Collins Street, where the Royal Mint building now stands.
Interesting. The Mint, hey?
So this is another little bit of information from the library. 200 ornate glass windows, as I said, a glass roof, and it was lit up by 306 gas lights for evening viewing.
Yes, I've started down that little rabbit hole of the gas lights and the fact that we have these pictures of this is the second, the one that's still standing, Expo building, and it's clearly got their light bulbs. Like they're not little, they don't point up, right? Gas lanterns have to be vertical, right? You can't have them, because the flames will go up. So yeah, what have you found? I'm only halfway down that rabbit hole.
Well, you'll love the other ones then. So yeah, 306 gas lights. So by the directory that I have from 1858, we had a lot, and I mean a lot, of gas plumbers. Now, that picture there is the inside of a building in Europe, and I'm really naughty. I took a screenshot of it, got distracted, and I didn't take the name. But that's an example of what that London Crystal Palace probably looked like inside. Because as you said, there's a lot of these glass buildings still around.
Yes.
Isn't it magnificent?
It's amazing. Like we wouldn't
absolutely,
even know.
It's a hotel. It's a hotel in Europe, and I'm sorry I didn't get the name. Naughty me. But it's magnificent. But it gives you a brilliant example of what the Crystal Palace would have looked like, or even what a glass roof looks like.
Yeah, I mean, look at this glass. It's all etched in. It's like, I mean, that's not just a pane of glass, right? They've then gone over and turned it into artwork.
And that's another thing. I will look and cross-reference everything that I read. One resource will tell you that the glass was plain or palely coloured, yet the information I got about the 1854 palace came from a full historian documentation done by the government, that stated that the glass used in the 1854 was very ornate.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So,
because the glass in the building still standing is just glass, right? It's not etched or anything, is it? So we've got this story again of devolvement, right? Like the older stuff is better, like more intricate, harder to produce.
absolutely, Campbell, absolutely. So if you go on to another picture I've got there, which is like a verse, it came after the catalogue cover. This song was described, I think in the first verse or the second verse, it says something very interesting.
So the exhibition ode, lo, I the fabric. I'm not sure what that means. The fabric as it rises, stately, luminous, and grand, while the future symbolizes of the fair Victorian land. Let each voice in chorus swelling echo through the crystal dome.
The
Enterprises
crystal
here.
dome.
Crystal dome, yeah, man. And so this date
So when you go,
there you go, October 15th, 1854. So this is definitely not the current Expo building.
no, it's the 1854 one, and this is part of the 1854 catalogue. On page 2 is the song that whatever it is, the poem or whatever they used to describe Victoria and this building, and it had a crystal dome. It also mentions, I think further down, something about crystal, more crystal.
Yeah, well, it's saying here as well that it had fountains, which is another
Yes,
thing. You know, people tend to
yes, the
ignore
fountains.
all the plumbing and actually what would need to go in for the infrastructure to make these fountains. You know, they're not just,
Absolutely.
they need like pressurized water, right? So it
Right.
had fountains. What have we got? Resources. Art shall lavish all the treasures. Shall I strengthen all? Yeah, okay. So knowledge free on each mind beaming shall give light and strength to all, like the brilliant sunlight streaming through this lofty crystal hall.
Hello. Why would you say that?
Like it. So
Why
it's
would you
obviously,
say crystal?
yeah, which means like the dome or the glass part was a massive feature, right? We're not talking about a little skylight or something here. It was pretty much the building, right?
Pretty much the building. Is that saying that this glass has crystallization in it?
Well, this is an interesting question. Why are they called crystal palaces when clearly we would think that they're glass palaces or glass houses or, or like, and this is something, with the 1850 Crystal Palace, that most people see as the original 1.5 mil glass. And,
Yes.
they were putting it up and walking around and getting it up and like, how do you make glass that thin? And they were 1.25 meters by like 3/4 of a meter, these panels. So they were big.
They were big.
So is the crystal, is that some kind of process, that makes them super strong, right? Because they weren't transported, I don't think, in horse and cart, but
No,
the
they
palace
couldn't
was
have
also
been.
too, right? Like the glass wasn't smashed. So, we believe it's a much older building, but the glass was still intact. So it had to be some kind of super glass, right?
Yep. Just interesting words, Campbell.
It
Why
is.
would you use crystal in your song to describe an exhibition building at that time? The only thing, like they would say glass, they know what the word glass was. It's a glass palace. It's got a glass roof. Why use the word crystal? And it's very predominant in that song. It's mentioned quite a few times. So they were enhancing the sound and the harmonious sound of that building to crystal.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Let each voice in chorus swelling echo through the crystal dome. So yeah, sound, right? Which is
Sounds.
like the choirs, right? That we know used to be in the cathedrals.
Correct.
Mm.
Correct. So just interesting words. So that's just there's so many rabbit holes, Campbell. Oh my God, it's just like, wow. Like when I read that, I thought, I've got to look into Windows now more, because did they actually use crystal like smashed crystal in their glass blowing? Not
Interesting.
far-fetched at all to believe that these window panes were actually had crystal resin in them for the sound and for the strength of these
Mm.
panes.
Yeah, interesting.
Food for thought.
Because crystals resonate right with frequency. Like if you play frequencies, like they'll actually start to move. So
That's exactly right.
mm,
And when you read some of the old writings and descriptions, they were very, very thing about the sound of a room, the sound and the echoes and the healing factors of the sound. And even in the Melbourne Royal Exhibition buildings, which we haven't even touched yet, the massive organ they had made for that, they totally didn't use, because the resin of sound was off, is the narrative. It was off. And the bellows of that organ were found in the basement of
yes,
the Royal Exhibition buildings. The
yes,
basement. We'll get into that in a minute.
yeah,
So
yeah.
the 1854, we're going to have to do a whole lot of these. The 1854 building was used for the 1854, and then it was also used again for another exhibition in 1860, I believe. But before we do go there was 434 exhibitions there. Now,
Yeah.
the 1854 exhibition has a very interesting story as well, which I found in Trove newspaper, because they actually describe the exhibition, and they actually describe something quite interesting. And that is that it was agreed that the London exhibition would hand over the French exhibition, what they were exhibiting, to Victoria, but Victorian government had to pay for the free transport of all goods to be exhibited. And Victoria agreed to that. And any damage or any goods that were sold had to be reimbursed to France. The French governor agreed to this, and then the French governor wanted free transport of all exhibition to be sent to Paris for the World Fair exhibition in Paris. This is interesting on an account of the fact that I thought we became a colony very quickly, because good old James Cook was sent out as not just an explorer, but an invader as far as I'm concerned. He looked at countries or continents and advised London of which continents to take, because they would be good countries for colonisation. And Australia was one of them.
Yeah.
Then we were told that the reason why it was so pushed was because the French were a threat, because they were looking at settling on Australia as well, and we were fighting with the French and da-da-la-la-la-la-la. And my Port Nepean story one day, which I hope to give you, also expresses why we had so many forts in our Port Phillip Bay, because of the French and the Russians were going to invade. Well, one minute we're doing that, and the next minute we're agreeing with the governor of France to freely bring over and transport all their exhibition items to
Yeah.
Australia, and then send them back free of charge and be good little Samaritans. What?
Yeah.
What is that?
It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? And also, like if we were worried about threat of invasion, why are we pouring all this money and manpower and resources into building crystal palaces?
Exactly, exactly. So if you want to go onto the next 2 pages of unusual, I found them unusual on the list because the catalogue obviously gives you a list of exhibitions.
Okay, so this is the exhibition catalogue.
Yep. Go see where I've marked it? Those 2 markings. I can't remember the numbers. 58 and something else. 56.
Yep.
Can you read that, Campbell?
Yeah, so we've got Turner, William J. from Williamstown, a watchmaker, model of a high-pressure beam steam engine, high-pressure beam. And Horton Henry from Melbourne, engineer, in the medical display, had a galvanic apparatus on improved principles designed so as to modify the force of the electric current.
Ah.
Wow.
What is that?
Wow.
What is that?
Man, I don't know. Is that some kind of Rife machine or frequency healing?
There's a quite
force of electrical current, and it's medical.
Yep. I think the above one had something to do with electrical. What's the one underneath say?
It is patent, boots, diggers, watertight boots. No, the one above is model of an improved cooking range. We've got native loo tables made from cedar, loo tables.
Yeah, I must have been half asleep, but that electrical one is very interesting. And I think there's another one too that describes something that is, I thought, what the hell is that?
Patent.
No, there's another page.
Piano. Patent.
No.
Patent enharmonic bar. I don't even know what that is.
Yes, there's just so many.
Artificial teeth, flower.
No, don't, Campbell. There's another page.
Oh, yeah, this will be part 2. Okay. Okay, can you still see that?
No, I can't see it at all. It's so tiny on my phone, but I think I've marked it somewhere.
Okay, here. So we've got Mechanics Institution, Melbourne, galvanic battery, electromagnetic machine.
There you go. Wow. There you go. 2 displays, and there was a few other really weird ones too, but I thought they really stood out. So they're really playing and showing electrical magnetic systems.
Yes. Yep, and this is
in 1854.
Yeah, this is 30 or 40 years before Tesla was even on the scene, right?
Correct.
He's supposed to be the dude who sort of knew all this, brought all this information forward. So my view of Tesla is it's all old world. He's from Serbia.
Absolutely.
Serbia was definitely a massive, point of Tartaria with a lot of the tech, and I think he's just got it. Stuff from the inventory, right? An inventor gets his stuff from the inventory that they've collected.
Yes, and have you ever looked at Tesla's actual inventions and the time span between his inventions?
I haven't gone through it, but I know that he was very prolific, shall we say, or at least supposed to be. He was just ripping stuff out.
He was very prolific. In 2 years, every 3 to 6 months, it started off every 3 months. He had invented some form of an amazing equipment, and then it went from 3 to 6 months, and then it went, to, I think it was 9 months, so 369, and then it went to 12 months, and then every 2 years he was inventing. How does? I'm sorry, that just doesn't. I don't know.
No, I mean, today,
maybe they were so much more intelligent than all of us.
Well, there's that, right? Today, when we're supposed to be so educated and intelligent, like, people are lucky to invent 2 things that are useful in their whole life. one every 3 months. Yeah.
It reads like a fictional book, and when I looked at it, I went, what? How can anyone possibly invent X-ray machines and anything electronic that he was using? I can't even list them off. I've got the research somewhere. In that time period.
Yeah, and this was when electricity was hardly even used or known. So he was literally creating everything. He had to have the power source and, you know, get all the electrics worked out before he even got started on the machine or the product, right?
You just reminded me of something else that I found very, very interesting in the minutes, because I've read the minutes for the 1854 exhibition buildings and all the esquires involved. Do you know what esquires means?
I don't. I'm thinking of Bill and Ted, because I think one of them called Bill Esquire, you know.
Apparently, esquire is a name you give someone that is just below a knight.
Yeah, well, that's
in English terms.
Squire used to be like a kind of royal term or whatever in the hierarchy, didn't it? So Esquire.
Yeah, military.
Military, okay.
So in the US, it meant someone who acquired land or was a landowner. But in the British, esquire means lower than a knight and of a higher importance of military. I think I counted over 10 esquires involved in the minutes and the decision-making of the exhibition buildings, and including a very interesting person who was the head commissioner for waters and sewerage and gas.
Nice. And he was a military dude, was he? He was an esquire.
He was an esquire.
It's interesting because, I mean, as far as the story of Australia, you know, I mean, I myself think it's pretty dodgy, right? This whole, they just turned up and they, you know, they had the convicts. And we don't, you know, we were both schooled in Australia, and I definitely never got taught that there was ever a threat from France or Germany, or taught that we had forts of any kind, let alone star forts or anything like that. It's just this, we turned up and, you know, then we had the swag men wandering around and building farms and the gold rush and everything just kind of happened. But it's a bit of a dodgy story.
Well, it's a dodgy story from 1788, Campbell, when they tell you that the first fleet convicts, which there were 6 convict ships, right? They arrived at an island called, you know, Fort Denison, and it just happened to have an old castle and a star fort.
It's exactly out in the middle of the harbour.
Who built it?
Yeah.
Who built that? I thought the whole idea of bringing convicts was for labour, for all these, and then all of a sudden, you know, we have an orphanage in Norfolk Island around the same time for all the orphan children, and then we have a women's orphanage in 1801 in Sydney for all the derelict women.
1801?
1801.
Wow. That's early, but yeah, because the narrative I've heard is Cook actually got here in 1770, not 1788, and the first fleet was not convicts; it was soldiers.
It certainly was. It certainly was, Campbell. But hey, you know.
Wow, I'm descended from convicts. Second fleet, I didn't make the first, so maybe I'm descended from soldiers. Who knows?
Maybe you are. Maybe you're all super soldiers because you built bloody places real quick before even anyone got here. And that's in our historical narrative. So go figure. So yeah, we go back to 1854 again. And hang on, I've just got to look at my notes. Okay, this was another interesting thing I found in Trove in an old newspaper, where there was a meeting held in regards to the just after the 1854 exhibition, where they were all debating whether they should pull the place down because, of course, it was built very quickly. And, you know, do we really need it? That sort of discussion. And everyone who was at that meeting all agreed that no, it was not going to be taken down. It was structurally sound and it was a place of beauty and we were going to keep it. And there was a person there who was he had a lot of research and a lot of stuff to back up his decision, which he had that much that everyone else didn't even know what to say anymore and just went along with him. But he made a very interesting point that I find very just out of context maybe for the discussion matter. But it was said, so this person said that the palace must be kept for the people of Victoria and Melbourne. And he remarked that the whole gold discovery was taking away the beauty they all needed to be cultivated and cultured people, which this palace would provide, because the whole gold rush discovery was predictable 12 years before.
And they knocked it over anyway.
They knocked it over it was used for many things, Campbell, and it was used for more exhibitions. So we had more exhibitions in 1861. We also had 1866. It was used for an exhibition in 1872 and 1875. Now, it was also used as a hospital for the Spanish flu, where they had over 2,000 people.
Wow. Fairly large.
Very large. And the architect, now we haven't gone into the old architect story, have we? The architect was Samuel Hayden, H-E-N-D-E-N, and Thomas Merritt, who arrived in Victoria at the age, Samuel was 25 and Thomas was 30. They came from England. And they had no architectural background, but they won the competition. And they arrived miraculously in 1853.
Okay. Less than a year to design and do all the groundwork, the formwork, get all the materials and put it together.
Oh, Campbell, my mind boggles every time I do research, because I sit there and I have those moments where you just do. I can't say anything because it's like, what the?
It's done. Like today in Australia, it takes 9 months to build an average house, like a, 2 or 3, like 3 or 4 bedroom, 2 bathroom house. That takes 9 months.
Yes.
Right, from start to finish. And that's a tiny little building, and they're whacking these things up in that time. But these are massive
77 days. I actually
everywhere.
have got. Yep.
And then, this is a story. They always knock them over, even though they've spent all this time and resource. And imagine, if that story is true of them importing all the glass, imagine what that would cost. And then they're just we'll just patch it. We've got too many buildings. We just knock it.
We were rich. We were rich. We had all this gold.
Melbourne was the richest country in the world, they say, in 1860.
Yeah, so they say.
So they say, thanks to the gold rush. But this is the thing about gold. Even if you have all the gold, you can't swap that for glass if no one's making glass. You can't swap that for iron if no one's making the iron you need. You can't.
Or bricks.
Bricks if there's not enough bricks there. So the gold doesn't make things manifest and appear, right? It's just it's dumb.
Exactly.
And then it's just gold, right? You'd have to ship it over to another country for payment, right? And then you're talking 6 to 9 months one way. It's a dumb story.
It's a dumb story. Why would you travel all that way for 12? Why would you send anything on a 12-month voyage for a 3-month exhibition?
Yeah, that you're going to, right, that you're going to knock over.
And where 40,000 people attended in that 3 months.
40,000.
Our population was not even, I think it was 70,000 for the whole of Victoria at that time.
Yeah.
So the population, I can do the population, it just doesn't fit.
No,
All the labour.
And the narrative says that 90% of people were just farmers, right? Living out on the land.
Yes.
Like, what would they be doing going to a bloody massive crystal palace and dressing up in their fineries? They wouldn't have even had them if we go by the narrative.
Or fighting off all the natives that were just spearing them and killing them left, right and centre. What a load of rubbish.
Yeah, yeah. And how
Absolutely
many toilets
rubbish.
would you need? How many toilets would you need for 40,000 people?
Exactly. How many horses? How many horses? How much food? We had hardly any food. We're actually relying on the First Nations people for food. People were starving. They had scarlet fever. They were dying of everything.
Yeah.
You know.
When the first fleet got here, they were out of food, they say.
Yes.
And they literally got here and they were almost starving when they landed. And then the narrative just says, oh, so we went out and made some farms and suddenly there was food everywhere. You didn't have to wait for the food to grow back then. You just said that's a farm and the food
it just appeared. It just appeared. It was just all there. Maybe it was all there.
Maybe it was all there. Exactly right. Maybe they found some warehouses. Because, I mean, we see, like, with trains and things like this, right? Like, I'm sure they found warehouses full of trains, full of other, clothes. Where did all the clothes come from? Where do they all look the same? All these. I agree. I think they were found. So, did they find food?
There is alternative First Nation books out there that tell you a different story of what the explorers saw, Campbell. And there were warehouses of food.
Like the city in Central Australia full of white people.
Correct.
That one, yeah.
And don't forget the French lieutenant who came into Botany Bay way before we were supposed to be here, or even old Cookie Boy came. He describes in his memoirs the mansions and the beautiful city on the cliffs of Botany Bay. And that's in this Sydney library. The Tartarian Truther girls who did the best research in the whole world, and I'm so sorry they don't do it anymore. They did a whole segment on that and they showed that piece of paper that they found in the Sydney library. Whether you can find it anymore, I don't know.
Okay.
But it's there. He describes in his memoirs and his journals the beauty of Botany Bay and how magnificent the mansions were and the cities that he saw.
That's interesting because I've got some interesting photos. I'll pop them up on the video. One is of a family standing in front of this mansion. It's from I think around the 1850s. I can't exactly remember, but it just looks like, they're standing in some old, like this mansion thing. And then there's the pictures of Canberra. What is it? Is it King Lake? Lake King or something?
Oh, I can't remember. Yeah.
That one, and it literally looks like the St. Louis world. Yeah.
Yes.
Like canals everywhere, like domes, this massive thing, and they're like, oh, and there's more than one of them, and the explanation is, oh no, that was just drawn, right? Because they wanted to build that, but they couldn't.
Right. Yeah, there's paintings. There's paintings in Canberra showing windmills. There's paintings in Sydney showing the Mystique. It's called the Mystique windmill on a hill in Sydney, painted in the early 1800s.
Well, yeah, one of the oldest buildings in Perth, the windmill, that's still there. I mean, I don't know if it's the original anymore, but it's right there across the river from the city, yeah.
And there's descriptions of early explorers that describe the windmills of the Dutch. And you know what, Campbell, we're going off segment here a little bit. And I knew this was going to happen.
It always happens.
I have to tell you this story, right? For my 50th birthday, we did up our barn, and in the toilet, I decoupage. Now, some people might not know what that word is anymore. But I had a very old newspaper from 1878 that I'd found when I had a shop. And I kept that newspaper, and my husband said to me, Paula, why don't you just put that newspaper up on the wall and decoupage it, which means I antique it and make it look old and literally glue it onto the wall. So I started doing that, Campbell. And then my husband said to me, you won't have enough newspaper if you use the original, you need to start photocopying it. So I started photocopying it. And I kept some of the original. Now, that's been there. I'm 63. That's been there for 13 years, right? I have read that wall God knows how many times because it absolutely fascinates me. The other day, and this happens to me all the time, I'm getting told to go out to that bloody toilet that I've looked at God knows how many times and look at it again. And I'm thinking, why? I know that wall inside out, and I'm being told, Paula, just do it. So Paula goes out to the toilet and looks at the wall and thinks, yeah, I know that one, I know that one, I know that one. And there it is, the colony of Melbourne, of Victoria. And I thought, and the exploration of Papua New Guinea. And I've gone, hang on a minute, I don't remember that. So I took a screenshot of it, a photo of it, sorry. And I sat and I read it, and I could not believe what I was reading, Campbell. The journalist in 1878 was describing or actually questioning the colonisation of Victoria and Melbourne back then. And he was questioning because he was part of a society. Now, I don't remember this society. We can go into this deeper if you want one day. But this society decided in the 16th century that far too much information was being displaced or disappearing from humanity to give us a clearer vision of our true past.
Yeah.
And I thought, are you kidding me? This is exactly what I've been doing. How come I've never seen this before? I read further. He was describing the only reason Captain Cook even came to Australia was because he followed Van Diemen's map. If he hadn't had Van Diemen's map, he wouldn't have known how to get here. I thought that's very interesting. And this society has been collecting encyclopedias since the 16th century on documentation and history that has disappeared. And they've gone and found it in old archives, in libraries, and questioned governments where these documentations are. Because he's part of this society, he saw all the holes already in the Australian discovery and the story we've been given. So he's decided, he's gone and contacted the society and said, listen, we have a problem in Australia. The explorers that have come here, their work is disappearing. Their description of what they see here has disappeared. We need to do something about it. So they contacted London, the head office in London, the libraries in London, the governor of London, and asked for an explanation of why certain explorers, certain artefacts and certain discoveries of the Aboriginals, certain arts of the Aboriginals had been displaced or missing, because they knew there was scripture there or journals that numbers were missing. And so London turned around and said, oh, are you right? We have some here, but not all of them. Oh, we've just found them in the bottom shelves of our archives. What? We'll release them. He said, you better release them, and I advise you to release them to the society because we don't want these records to be lost. He then goes on to say that most of the records of what people saw in Australia, most of them have been lost. Hence, we go to the 1882 Crystal Palace of Sydney that had most of our documentation, our 1881 census, documentation of what the explorers saw before and after they came to Australia, documentation of artefacts that were found, very strange artefacts that were found, documentation of arts of the Aboriginals and their memoirs, and what the explorers saw had all been conveniently burnt in the basement of
Yeah.
that Crystal Palace.
Yeah.
What are the odds of me finding that, Campbell?
Yeah. I mean, that's a crazy story, right? That's literally it. Everything, all the history of Australia was in the Crystal Palace, in the basement, and of course it was another, glass and iron building, and it burnt down, and everything went, apparently.
So what were the chances of me finding that piece? I wasn't meant to see that until I was ready to see it, Campbell. I was not meant to. And you know what? It is part of the original newspaper, and what makes this even weirder is that I went into Trove to find that page and it doesn't exist.
No way.
No way. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, which is at least circumstantial evidence, right? That they're editing our history, rewriting it, getting rid of what doesn't fit the narrative. And fires are very convenient. I mean, these have happened everywhere, so it's probably the same story in many places, right? Like, get rid of all the old information, just burn it, right? Just burn it, and then it's gone.
Yep.
Burn it.
Or store it and then tell people that it all burnt, whatever the thing is. But yeah, good way to clear the slate, right? And then you can just introduce the new narrative. Oh no, we know what was there. We'll tell you what was there. Nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I don't know if you've heard of the Black Emu book by Pascoe, who's been absolutely, like, he won all these medals for his book, and now they're just hammering him, and like a lot of us are getting hammered because what we're saying is a load of crap. Now they're saying what he said's a load of crap, but it's not. I've got evidence on my wall because the Papua New Guinea story that he tells backs up what he's saying about the Aboriginals and their farming and their communities and their huge housings and the way that the British destroyed their farms and how the British had to use they weren't bringing their cattle over to look for new places because the ground was so awesome. It was awesome. The cattle were starving. So the cattle were grazed everywhere to eat everything that the Aboriginals had planted and used for centuries. And I've got this Papua New Guinea story in 1878 that backs what Bruce said.
This is one of the big questions that I get constantly is, what do the natives know about these buildings? What do they say about the buildings being here? Shouldn't we ask them? And we just get taught this narrative of, they were just basically Stone Age people, right? They maybe had a bark hut and a spear, and that was pretty much it.
And they moved around and lived in caves.
And
lived on riverbanks.
Wanderers, all this stuff. But it looks like there's a bit of evidence that they were farmers, that they had proper, that they were, a civilized society, or civilized, right? At least much more advanced than we were told. So I'd definitely love to go down that rabbit hole.
After the last Tartarian event that you did, and we did all those groups, the pink group, blue group and everything, so we could all communicate.
Yes.
I had someone who I'm still very good friends with, and we can't find it anywhere, which really pisses me off. She came across a lady in Gembrook who owned a shop. She was an Aboriginal lady, and they were talking about the same thing. Why aren't we given any information? If all this was here, why don't they know? And she actually had a painting that my friend took a photo of that shows market gardens, fruit trees, and vegetables being grown on the Yarra River by her tribe.
We need to definitely dive down that a bit more, right? Because this is the thing, in Australia, we also had the stolen generation, right? So they literally went around and kidnapped people's children and threw them into, religious re-education factories, basically, right? They all went to these religious places with all these dodgy people running them.
Families, white families.
Why? Families, dress them differently. They weren't allowed to speak their original languages anymore. So that they literally cut the generational information.
Correct. They couldn't tell the stories anymore, Jason. And And they started in Tasmania. They literally genocided the whole of the Aboriginals in Tasmania because they were the oldest dynasty of the First Nations. So they knew a lot. And so when they were finished with them, they started in Australia. And I've got a whole thing on that too.
Yeah, it's a good point because we just don't know, well, at least we're told we don't know anything really about the Tasmanian natives because they were wiped out so early. All I remember learning was they had dreadlocks. And that's the only thing I remember for some reason is they said they had dreadlocks. But there's nothing there. And I don't know, I haven't really searched, but I don't think there's even any, Aboriginal cave art or the traditional kind of, artifacts, relics, whatever. There doesn't seem to be anything in Tasmania.
No, they've wiped it all. And going on that, remember that little story we just talked about, that guy from the ABC who did that series that found the journal, someone sent him an extract of a journal of a Dutch colony being found in Central Australia that he found as an explorer?
I have not seen that either. Oh my God.
Okay, I'm going to send that through to you.
Right. Send it through. So that sounds like the same place that Stephen and Evan Strong were telling us about, like this city in Australia.
Correct.
And the story was that all these convicts were rebelling and saying, we're not going to sit, just work for you. And so they started taking off and they met some, natives, Aboriginals, who told them, well, you need to go into the centre of Australia. That's where the big city full of white fellas like you is. What are you doing out here? So
this explorer came through the top of Cape York and he found a settlement of Dutch people. And he said the Aboriginals were even saying ja and nee as yes and no in Dutch because I'm Dutch. The interesting thing is, when he was looking for that settlement, he came across a rock with an etching of a European woman in European clothing with a European face. And this was in 1600s. I'll send it through to you, Campbell.
And there was supposed to be no one here. I mean, all we get told about the Dutch really is what Dirk Hartog, right? One boat that basically ran aground or ran into a reef, and some of the people managed to get off and make the mainland, and we're just told that they sort of survived, some of them with a tribe, and then they died. And so and I think they use that to say that's why a lot of native children are born with blonde hair and blue eyes.
Blue eyes, correct. But what about the original New Zealanders? They had red hair and blue eyes and came from Easter Island, and they were Polynesian, and they also lived in Hawaii. So la-da-da-da-da. They also came to Australia. The redhead blue eyes came to Australia too. So, when people look at us and our research and what we do and how passionate we are like this because that nothing adds up. And I don't care what time frame you talk about, nothing adds up. And when you look at Australia, it is the perfect place to ask questions because nothing does add up, Campbell.
No, and 250 years, well, not less, right?
Correct.
That white man's been here, apparently. It's a very short timeline. Our cities were, I think Perth was 27, Melbourne was 1830s, like they were all pretty late. And then suddenly in 20 years after they're founded, massive cities everywhere.
Correct. And I will send you an artistry impression from the roof of the 1854 exhibition building of Melbourne. It'll blow your mind. Comes from the library, the State Library, so it's got to be real. So it shows the observatory that we had because Melbourne had a telescope in early 1850s, a fully functional telescope.
Yeah, so did Perth, a massive one with one of those big domes on the top with a telescope. It's just out in the middle of nowhere by itself, no roads going to it.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct. And there is a pole that is so high in this painting with just a little aerial on the top. Nothing else.
Interesting.
And it's so built up, Campbell. It's so built up. So going back quickly to your stolen generation, I have to get this out now. The stolen generation. They were stolen to sever the stories deliberately for future generations, as you said, right? They were given new identities, new clothing, new families, new narratives, new schooling, new education, and totally severed from their traditional beliefs, their stories, their parents, anything that connected them to their own culture, correct?
Yeah, totally, man.
What did we do to the British children, Campbell, in the industrial age, in the early 1800s, in 1788? We dispersed children.
Yeah, man.
And took them from their families. You know, we had military authorities. We had military authorities in England that were in the 17th century that were removing children, putting them in jail to be sentenced. They were sentenced as an adult so they could be hung. They could be put to hard labour. I've got stories of children as young as 6 that were put to labour. There was a 9-year-old girl that came on the first convict ship who was meant to be hung, but was reprieved to come here for transport and immigration. What happened to those children? Were they not severed from their parents so that all their identity was lost? If you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going, you don't know who you are.
Totally. Yeah. It's happened to us all. Obviously, they try and make us hyper focus on the more native people, but it's happened to us all. I mean, the word slave comes from Slavic, which is white people for starters. So I mean, the whole narrative we're given about that is complete crap. It's not one
crap.
race, one people. It's all of us, and it was to sever that connection to the information.
Our culture. Our culture has been severed, our understanding of our culture, so that we don't remember anything. So for decades to come, we can regurgitate the narrative that's been given, the education that's been given, and all the bullshit and the industrial crap that's been given to us into our decades in the future. So no wonder we've had our memories erased.
Yeah.
It's no wonder.
It's like Graham Hancock says, right? We're a species with amnesia. And I just had a thought.
Correct.
I mean, is the way that it's supposed to work, and you would probably think that's right? Are we supposed to learn all this from our parents, family, and community because they actually had the information of who we were, where we came from, what it was all about?
Correct.
And they've severed that, and now no one knows what's going on. Everyone's got this. Everyone wants to know, who are we? Where did we come from? What's the deal? We just don't have. So it probably used to get passed down when you were a young child, and so people weren't as confused back then, right?
That's why there's people out there saying that what we talk about is bullshit, that we've got enough evidence to prove that what we say is bullshit. Well, no, that can't be evidence because you've got children who have had their memories wiped.
Yeah, provably.
And why did we need all these orphanages in Australia? We didn't have an overpopulation of anybody, let alone children.
No. And I mean, back then, even if you didn't particularly like your children, if you weren't a particularly good parent, they were worth their weight in gold, right? Because if everyone, we're told, was on a farm, you wouldn't give away a farm worker, and that's literally what the children were back then, right? So why is everyone giving up their children? Then on top of that, we've got the mental asylums and then the whole convict prison thing. It seems like 90% of the population, right? They're either orphans in an asylum or in jail.
Correct. So we had convict children come here, those poor children that were ripped off the streets. Half the parents didn't even know where their children were. They weren't just derelict children. Then there's childbearing women or children that were brought over deliberately and put into farms. Don't even go down that road with me. I tell you, that's another whole story. Factories and farms of women.
The handmaid's tale, yes.
The handmaiden, exactly. And then, I didn't hear, I won't go down there.
No.
I won't bring anything up. Anyway, so we've got all these it's not even weird. Look, I don't know about you, Campbell, but I feel like my memories come back. And I feel that where we're at the moment, I've seen it all before. I've felt it all before. I know, it almost feels like you know what's going to happen before it's going to happen. And that's why I'm so passionate about my research, is because I've been doing this since I was a child.
Yeah,
I've
me
been
too.
researching since a child. And I've known that this whole timeline is off.
Totally,
And,
man. That was literally my first thought was, you've dropped me in the wrong place. This place is crazy.
Yeah.
Everyone's bad. Come back and get me. But they didn't.
Yes, I used to cry because I felt I was brought in the wrong timeline. My timeline was the 1800s. That's what I was connected to. Everything I did, everything I looked at, everything I collected was back in the 1800s because I felt such a strong connection to that timeline.
Yeah, I was the same. I was anything old I could find, I would hoard when I was growing up, like anything, right? And that's a good point, because we have some kind of connection to it. But yeah, man, they've changed the story, right? His story. That's what we get now.
Exactly. Exactly.
Story.
Absolutely right, Campbell. But there is so many things we could go down. And I know we started with the exhibition buildings, but anyway, it always happens, and it's meant to happen. That's that's the whole point. It's meant to happen. We are the vessels of knowledge, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't care what anyone says. That knowledge comes deep within us, and we can't even explain where that knowledge comes from or who's even controlling that knowledge. Because I tell you right now, Campbell, I am sometimes literally switched off. This meat suit is switched off, and something else comes through that is so forceful. It's very forceful, Campbell, and it just wants the information out, and it does not care who it offends or how it comes out. And I try to be as diplomatic as I can, but sometimes I can't control it, and it's not an excuse for having no personal boundaries, because I know I don't have any. I'll just admit that straight away. But it comes from somewhere. I can't explain where it comes from, Campbell, and it's a knowing. It's a knowing, and it's like, as soon as you know it happens to you. I know it happens to Kelly. We're on a subject, and all of a sudden it's like it's all coming from all around you. It's like an energy that comes in, and next thing it just comes through, and it's like, right, Paula, get over there. I'm using you right now to get it out there, because it needs to be told.
Yeah, man.
It needs to be told.
The truth will win, right? And the truth will set you free. So I agree. I get all that stuff all the time. That's kind of how I got here. Strange messages to make channels and videos. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? But here we are. So
I do it, and I research, and like I said, I've researched for years. I used to go and look at architecture when I was in my teenagers years, and I've told you the story. I used to go and clean cemeteries. I'd go and find the oldest cemetery at the back of my house in Lilydale, and I would clean it. I would service these cemeteries, and I would connect with the stories on those tombstones. And I was very passionate about those old tombstones. Why? It's just not a normal thing for a 6-year-old to do. It's not normal, really.
Wow.
But nothing about me is normal.
No.
Anyway, that's another story. That's another story, Campbell.
I know. It's normal, not normie, right? Because this is how everyone should be asking these questions, but yeah, the vast majority, right? So
correct.
They're still confused.
Correct. Wow. So I wanted to do the 1880. So quickly, let me just quickly say this. We had another exhibition buildings between 1854 and 1880.
Okay. Because
it was built.
It was 7980 was the one we've got now, isn't it?
Yep, 1880 was the Royal Exhibition Buildings, the big one.
Yep.
Yep. Well, we actually had the Great Hall and Rotunda. building. The second exhibition buildings were built for the intercolonial exhibition of 1866 and 1867. It was at the back of the now public library, Melbourne's public library. So I don't know if you and Kelly went there when you came to Melbourne, but you remember that, did you go in the library with the big dome?
Yeah, we did, man.
That dome was part of the original rotunda of the exhibition building of that time.
Okay, interesting, because the library kind of looks weird. It looks like it's got an add-on at the back. Yeah, right.
That's correct. That's correct.
That's the one where there's photos of that, or drawings, or I can't remember what they were.
There's a drawing. There's a drawing in the
dome changes size.
Yep. And going back to 1854, the only construction photo I could find was a drawing. And the only construction photos you can find for the dome and the other exhibition buildings is a drawing or a 3D version that the library gives you.
Yeah. And of course, photography, first photo, 1827. So by the 1850s, you could take photos. These were the biggest buildings, ever built, all for exhibitions, all to showcase Melbourne and Australia to the rest of the world, and no one thought of taking a photo.
Take any photo. No, they did after. Oh, definitely after.
Yeah.
So that was also a competition won by Reed and Barnes, who apparently were the best architects of that time. So two more exhibitions were held on the site, the Victorian exhibition, 1872, another exhibition, 1875. So we're doing exhibitions, the 1854 was taken down in 1861.
7 years, why not?
Why not? So, the other thing that they had in 1854, which I didn't mention, was the hydro incubator and egg hatchery. Not for children not for children though at that stage, but that's where it came from in France.
Hydro incubator. Wow. And
a
then
hydro incubator.
Some birds, I'm thinking. Obviously, it could be reptiles, I guess.
No, for egg hatchery, which the original baby incubator was called an egg hatchery for children in France when that was first designed. We also are advertising artificial sandstone blocks. So we're making artificial sandstone blocks.
Geopolymer, interesting.
And remember my discussion with you about bluestone?
Yes.
And we don't believe bluestone's stone, and I can prove it. Anyhow, that's another story. Examples of colonial bluestone. We have a perforating brick machine. So the perforating brick machines weren't actually used at that stage. They were used much later in the 1890s. Lots of electroplating products. There was a 6-light chandelier that was an oil chandelier, and there was many gas chandeliers. And imitation marble columns, Campbell.
Yes, well, I've seen photos of them, not from Australia, but columns that are broken, and they're not solid columns, man, and they're not.
No, but
and this is what Paul Cook talks about a lot. Is he thinks everything is geopolymer, and this starts from the pyramids, even, right? Like there's a guy, what's his name, Davido Davitus or something. Who all the tests on the pyramid saying it was geopolymer. Yes. How do we get all these megalithic walls with no joins? They're pouring
exactly. They were put in sacks and left to dry, which you can actually see that happening. And when I look at bluestone, I see the same thing. I see air pockets. I see impressions that aren't natural. I see sags. When I show people and they look and they go, "Oh my God, I don't see stone anymore," because they're so heavy, Campbell.
Well, this is the other thing. How do they move them, right? If you've got a some kind of mold and you're just pouring it in or whatever, then it's a different story. You know?
Wow, we go back to our glass and crystal then, don't we? Same, but different.
Well, exactly right. It's just, yeah, they're just creating their own products that were clearly far superior to the ones we got today, right? Like
correct, which would make sense. It would make sense for the transportation of that time, Campbell.
Yes.
And the distances. If we had crushed elements of these, that would make a lot more sense. So just quickly going, I'm going to blow my little story of the exhibition buildings of 1880, sorry. Have you ever read any information about how it was actually built?
The Melbourne?
Yes.
No. Well, I mean, I've looked into it a bit as far as, but I didn't get much out of it. You know, I was looking at how many plumbers were there, how many builders, how many glass makers, none of it added up. But basically the story I got was, mainstream media just says, you know, someone designed it and then they built it. And that's when you don't get any mention of who built it or how, right?
Well, we had a competition again in 1877 for the design of the new exhibition buildings, which was awarded to Reed and Barnes, Melbourne again. And going back to the old designers of the 1854, I did their genealogy, and I can't find anything about Thomas Merritt except when he came over, nothing about him owning any architectural firm, and their father was a gaslighter.
Gaslighter.
Yeah, and I then thought, okay, I'm going to research architecture. So I researched the basis of architecture. They needed no background in building, carpentry, or anything. All they had to do was go to Greece or Rome and study the architecture for a little while, and then they were able to advise on architecture. There was no actual architecture institute till the late 1800s.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. You know, if you want to become a doctor, just watch someone perform an operation and there you go. You're a doctor, right?
Exactly.
But
exactly.
It's the same story. Like the guy who did I've forgotten his name, the Crystal Palace. What was his name in London? He was a gardener.
He was a gardener.
And he decided to make a glass house, and they went, wow, what a good glass house. And then he thought, well, I'll design a Crystal Palace, the biggest building ever built in London.
So what that tells me, if he was a gardener, were all these crystal palaces already existing and were they already used for the food source?
Yeah, well, this is what I definitely think. Well, it's a definite possibility, right? I'm just can't remember the guy's name. But yeah, the Crystal Palace guy in London, he built a series of glass houses, like really amazing old world glass houses. And one of the ones in England is where we get Cavendish bananas from.
There you go.
Like, he apparently, you know, was the first to create the Cavendish banana, and that was the one that had lily pads in it that were so big you could stand on them.
Yes. So he needed the environment, and he also found that if he could redo a sound of this particular bird that only sung the songs at a particular time in the season when some of these plants grew at their maximum, he could then make an environment that they could grow over longer periods of time.
Nice.
He's a very interesting man to research.
Yeah. I'll pop his name on screen because I can't remember what it is. But and then we had Francis, whatever his name was, in Sydney, who, you know, designed 10 or 15 of the biggest, best buildings there, all in a couple of years. Wasn't an architect, wasn't a builder, wasn't an engineer. So it's the same story over and over and over again. It's just recycle.
Correct. Merritt had no background in architecture whatsoever that I could find at all.
Merritt.
So
Yeah.
I haven't actually looked into the old architects for. Didn't have time for the award winners of Reed and Barnes, but I will look into them. But the foundation, Campbell, which the foundation stone was put down, I think. Oh God, let me see. I haven't written it down. It was in 1879, and I think it was the December of 1879, and they opened in the October of 1880, and it was ready for exhibition to be displayed in the May of 1880.
Wow. Okay. So they could start setting up kind of thing before it was even open. So what's that, 4 months?
Correct. It was ready.
Yeah.
And we had the plinths and the foundation of that building was of bluestone.
Yes.
And I read that it was up to 6 feet in width.
Yes. Yeah.
In width, which meant that the walls. Hey?
The foundations would kind of have to be that big because these buildings are so massive.
Correct. Correct. So we've got 6 feet wide of bluestone foundation with the accommodating 6 feet wide layers of bricks.
Bricks. Yep. 6 foot wide walls. Yep. Hence the millions of bricks that took to build it.
650 million bricks were required to build that building. 2.1 million were required for the Crystal Palace in their foundations. And we also had a basement again because it became a mortuary at one stage.
Yep. Whole lower level. We know about lower levels. Wow. All right. Well, we might have to leave it there for this one, but I think we're going to have to come back and continue this story, right? Because there's so much to talk about. Like there's so many rabbit holes. But yeah, man, that was cool. Thanks.
I'm sorry, Campbell. I can't keep on track, but my mind just goes 100 miles an hour. And that thing that comes through just says, tell them this, tell them this, tell them, you've got to go there, you've got to go here. And it's like, oh, please. So I probably won't even remember half the things I've said, but I've got so much in here that needs to come out. It really does. The research I've done has to come out. People need to know.
Well, let's do it, man. Let's expose Australia and get down to the nitty gritty, and show it. It's just not possible. Like there was no brick makers, there was no glass makers, there was no metal makers, but yet and no people to build it, but they still built it. Apparently.
They still built it. Yep. And we'll make sure we cross-reference all our dots too, and we'll make sure it's all substantial evidence that we're using, because it can only be that way, Campbell. Yeah.
And it's not that hard to do, really, is it?
No, it's not. There's plenty out there. It's plenty of information in the books, old newspapers, everywhere.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, leave us comments, guys. What do you think? You've got any extra information you can add? What do you think is going on in Australia? Is there anything in particular you want us to talk about? And I'll also get as many links as I can and put them in the description so we can have a bit of a look around as well. And I guess we'll be back in a week for, well, it's going to be part 3 now because we had an interview, but I actually lost it for a few weeks, but it's been found.
Yes, we found it.
So this should be number 2. So we'll be back for chat number 3 in a week.
Wonderful. Thanks, Campbell. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula. We'll talk to you soon. See ya. Bye.
Remember, in the end, nobody wins unless everybody wins. Come on!